When the fog finally began to clear over the French countryside near Aricourt on that September afternoon in 1944, specifically at 12:47 in the afternoon on the 20th day of the month, Major Charles Carpenter peered through the windscreen of his Piper L4 Grasshopper and spotted something that made his hands grip the control stick more tightly. German armoured vehicles were moving across the open fields below him, heading straight toward where American troops had established their positions. This lightweight observation aircraft had never been intended for what was about to unfold, yet here he was, preparing to do something that most people would consider absolutely insane. Just days before this moment, Carpenter had spoken to a correspondent from Stars and Stripes, telling the journalist something that would come to define everything about his approach to combat. He believed that fighting a war meant attacking continuously, every single minute of every single hour, around the clock without pause. These weren't just words for this former teacher from Illinois. They represented his entire philosophy about how to conduct warfare, and that philosophy had led him to transform his unarmed observation plane into something the designers at Piper Aircraft Company could never have imagined. The aircraft Carpenter was flying that day carried 6 bazookas mounted on its wing struts. What made this engagement so remarkable was that the German tank crews sitting inside their 45-ton Panther tanks and 57-ton Tiger tanks had absolutely no idea they were about to be attacked by what appeared to be nothing more than a small civilian training plane covered in fabric and weighing barely more than 1,200 pounds. The German soldiers would eventually give Carpenter a nickname that spoke to their bewildered frustration at being hunted by such an unlikely opponent. They called him the Mad Major. Looking at the numbers involved made the whole situation seem impossible. The Continental engine in Carpenter's L4 produced only 65 horsepower, which was actually less power than what it took to run the cooling fan on a Tiger tank. His top speed of 85 miles per hour was slower than the rate at which a Panther tank could rotate its turret to face a new threat. The cotton fabric covering his aircraft could be punctured by a pistol bullet. Yet when that September day came to an end, 2 Panther tanks would be burning wrecks in the French countryside, their crews unable to comprehend that they had been destroyed by what looked like something a wealthy civilian might fly on weekends for pleasure. The engagement at Aricourt represented something significant in the larger context of the war. Germany was making its final major armoured counter-offensive in the Lorraine region, and General Hasso von Manteuffel had assembled quite a force for the task. His 5th Panzer Army included 262 tanks and assault guns, with some of Germany's most elite units participating in the attack. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were there, along with the veteran 11th Panzer Division. These units fielded 107 Panthers and 75 Panzer IVs, with another 80 assault guns providing support. This was a formidable concentration of armoured power, all aimed at stopping Patton's advance toward the German border. Among these attacking forces, the 113th Panzer Brigade was particularly noteworthy, despite having been formed hastily. They had been equipped with some of Germany's most advanced armoured vehicles. The Panther tanks that were advancing that morning represented the absolute pinnacle of what German engineering could produce for armoured warfare. Each one mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank from distances exceeding 2,000 metres. Their frontal armour was sloped at 55 degrees and measured 80mm thick, which meant it could deflect most of the anti-tank weapons the Allies possessed. However, these magnificent machines had a critical vulnerability that their designers had never taken seriously. The armour on the roof of a Panther measured only 16 to 25mm thick, and on Tigers it was 25mm. German engineers had focused all their attention on protecting these tanks from threats at ground level, never imagining that their greatest danger might descend from above, and certainly never considering that the threat could come from an observation plane armed with nothing more than infantry weapons. German military doctrine regarding observation aircraft had remained consistent throughout the entire war. Aircraft like the L4 Grasshopper and similar light planes were considered harmless spotters. The policy was to leave them alone, because shooting at them would only reveal German positions and invite artillery fire from Allied forces. This tactical calculation seemed perfectly sound, but it was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, who commanded the 58th Panzer Corps, would later provide an assessment of these newly formed panzer brigades. He rated them as having only slight combat value due to their incomplete training and inadequate equipment. The units particularly lacked proper reconnaissance capabilities, which forced them to advance without clear intelligence about what they would face. They were about to encounter something that no amount of training or reconnaissance could have prepared them for. Charles Marston Carpenter had been born on August 29, 1912, in rural Illinois. His family worked farms, and the Great Depression had devastated them financially. When his parents divorced, young Charles and his siblings often found themselves working on neighboring farms just to help make ends meet. Despite these hardships, Charles excelled in his studies. He earned scholarships that allowed him to attend Roosevelt Military Academy in Aledo, Illinois, and later Center College in Danville, Kentucky. Before the war consumed everything, Carpenter had made his living as a history teacher at Moline High School. He married a woman named Elda Fritschel in 1940, and they had a daughter together named Carol. But war was approaching, and when America finally entered the conflict in 1942, the 30-year-old teacher did what so many other Americans were doing. He enlisted, received his commission as a second lieutenant, and completed his flight training. By 1944, he had been promoted to major and found himself assigned to the 1st Bombardment Division in France, before being transferred to fly artillery support missions for General George Patton's 4th Armoured Division. His primary assignment involved flying reconnaissance and artillery spotting missions in an L-4 Grasshopper, which was the military designation for what was essentially a Piper J-3 Cub. He also served as the personal pilot for General John Wood, who commanded the 4th Armoured Division. This position gave Carpenter something unusual and valuable: the freedom to pursue his own initiatives rather than being restricted to standard flight patterns and schedules. The aircraft assigned to him bore the serial number 43-30426, and it would soon gain a name that played off the famous Rosie the Riveter imagery from wartime propaganda. They called it Rosie the Rocketer. In August of 1944, Carpenter wrote a letter home to Elda that revealed just how dangerous his daily life had become. He told her that he had been taking quite a few chances lately, but his luck had been marvelous. Just the previous day, he had gotten a bullet hole through his wing and had hit a church steeple with one wheel. He acknowledged it was very little compared to what might have happened under the circumstances. His philosophy of warfare came through clearly in his conversations with reporters. He told Associated Press correspondent Wes Gallagher that his idea of fighting a war was to attack, and then attack again. Carpenter wasn't the first person to conceive of putting bazookas on an L-4. Two lieutenants named Harley Merrick and Roy Carson had experimented with mounting bazookas on their observation planes earlier in the campaign, and they had successfully destroyed 2 German trucks with the weapon system. But Carpenter would take this concept and perfect it, pushing it to unprecedented levels of effectiveness. The modification process began with 2 M1A1 bazookas attached to the wing struts of his aircraft. Working closely with ordnance technicians, Carpenter developed a mounting system that used plywood backing plates to distribute the weight and recoil forces across the fragile wing structure. Electrical wiring ran from the launch tubes all the way to toggle switches mounted in the cockpit, which allowed him to fire the rockets either individually or in volleys depending on the tactical situation. Initial testing revealed several problems with the setup. The M1A1 bazookas fired 2.36-inch diameter rockets that could penetrate about 3 inches of armor. This was sufficient for engaging light vehicles, but marginal at best against proper tank armor. Carpenter upgraded to 6 M9 bazookas that fired improved M6A3HEAT rounds. These high-explosive anti-tank rockets could penetrate 3.9 inches of armor at a 30-degree impact angle, which was enough to defeat the thin top armor of any German tank in service. The complete modification added approximately 106 pounds to an aircraft that was already operating at its maximum weight capacity. With a gross weight limit of 1,220 pounds, and with the pilot, fuel and basic equipment already accounting for most of that capacity, Carpenter had no choice but to fly alone. The observer's position had to remain empty because there simply wasn't enough lift capacity for another person. The aerodynamic impact proved significant. The bazookas created substantial drag, which reduced the already modest top speed and made the aircraft even more sluggish when attempting to turn. This plane that had been designed for gentle observation flights now carried the firepower of 6 infantry anti-tank teams. The technical challenge of hitting a tank from an L4 seemed almost insurmountable. The aircraft had no gun sight and no aiming system beyond what the pilot could judge with his own eyes. The bazookas were fixed to fire straight ahead, which meant Carpenter had to point the entire aircraft directly at his target. The M6A3 rockets had an effective range of about 300 yards, but accuracy decreased dramatically beyond 100 yards. To achieve a hit, Carpenter had to develop a specific attack profile that would become his signature technique. He would start from an altitude of about 1,500 feet. Once he spotted his target, he would begin a corkscrew descent designed to confuse anti-aircraft gunners on the ground. This spiral approach made it extremely difficult for ground forces to predict his flight path and establish an effective lead for their weapons. At approximately 300 feet, he would level out briefly, align his aircraft with the target, and then push into a steep dive. The final approach required extraordinary courage. At 100 yards, barely 300 feet from the target, Carpenter would toggle his firing switches and send rockets streaking toward the enemy armor. Immediately after firing, he would pull up sharply, using every bit of the L4's limited power to climb away from the inevitable return fire. The entire attack sequence, from beginning the dive to climbing away, took less than 30 seconds, but those were 30 seconds of maximum vulnerability to enemy fire. The Continental A65 engine struggled terribly with the additional weight and drag of the rocket installation. The plane's normal climb rate of 450 feet per minute dropped to barely 200 feet per minute when fully loaded with rockets. Every foot of altitude was precious because it meant another second away from effective small arms range and another moment to plan the next attack. The morning of September 20th began with thick fog that kept most aircraft grounded. Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce Clark's leadership, was holding positions near Aracourt when intelligence reports indicated that German armor was massing for an attack. Carpenter took off despite the weather conditions, trusting that they would improve. When the fog finally lifted around noon, Carpenter was already airborne and searching for targets. Below him, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade were advancing. A company of Panther tanks was moving in formation across open ground toward American positions. The German crews, trained to scan constantly for enemy tanks and anti-tank guns, never considered the small observation plane circling high above them as any kind of threat. Carpenter began his attack run, entering the characteristic corkscrew descent that had become his trademark maneuver. The dive was steep, and the aircraft shuddered as its speed built up. At precisely 100 yards he fired, and 6 rockets streaked toward the lead Panther. The rocket struck the thin roof armor and penetrated into the crew compartment. The tank lurched to a stop with smoke pouring from its hatches. Banking hard left, Carpenter climbed away as machine gun fire erupted from the German column below. He could hear bullets punching through the fabric skin of his aircraft as he struggled desperately for altitude. Within 30 minutes he had landed, reloaded his rockets, and was airborne again. His second sortie found the German tanks attempting to reorganize their formation. They had spread out, making themselves harder targets, but also disrupting their own advance in the process. Carpenter selected another Panther and dove again. This time the Germans were ready for him. Small arms fire filled the air around his aircraft. The distinctive sound of bullets tearing through fabric accompanied him throughout the entire dive. But his aim remained true, and another Panther was knocked out, its turret crew killed by the blast that penetrated the 16mm roof armour. On his third sortie that afternoon, Carpenter found the surviving tanks beginning to reverse course. Their advance had been completely disrupted. By the end of the day, he had fired 16 rockets total. 2 Panther tanks were confirmed destroyed, the German advance had been halted, and the legend of Bazooka Charlie was born. The 4th Armoured Division's official history would specifically note his role in stopping what could have been a successful German counterattack. Before Carpenter's attacks, German military doctrine had treated observation aircraft as minor annoyances at worst. Standard procedure was to ignore them unless they presented an immediate threat, because engaging them would reveal positions and invite artillery strikes. This seemed like a poor tactical trade. But this calculation changed completely after word spread throughout German units about the rocket-armed L-4s. German units began receiving urgent bulletins warning them about American observation planes carrying anti-tank weapons. What had been harmless spotters were now potential tank killers requiring immediate engagement. Carpenter himself noticed the change immediately. As he told a Stars and Stripes reporter, every time he showed up now, they shot at him with everything they had. They never used to bother Cubs before. The bazookas must be bothering them quite a bit. The impact on German operations went far beyond just the tanks that were actually destroyed. Tank commanders now had to constantly watch the skies for slow-moving aircraft. Formations had to spread out whenever L-4s appeared, which disrupted their momentum and coordination. Anti-aircraft weapons had to be redirected from protecting against fighter bombers to engaging observation planes. Infantry units were ordered to engage any L-4 with rifles and machine pistols, creating a curtain of fire that made low-altitude operations increasingly hazardous for American pilots. The 113th Panzer Brigade had entered the Battle of Aracourt with 90 tanks. Within a week, only 27 remained operational. While not all these losses could be attributed to Carpenter's personal actions, his attacks contributed significantly to the psychological pressure that degraded German combat effectiveness. Tank crews who had felt relatively safe from air attack in poor weather now faced a threat that could appear at any time. Carpenter's most daring exploit came when he engaged Tiger tanks. These massive vehicles were among the most feared tanks in the German arsenal. Each weighed 57 tons and mounted armour up to 100mm thick on the front hull, but their roof armour measured only 25mm, still vulnerable to Carpenter's rockets. His attack on the Tigers required exceptional courage, because these tanks were typically surrounded by infantry and light anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to protect against air attack. Carpenter dove through a curtain of tracer fire, released his rockets at minimum range, and pulled up just as explosions erupted behind him. One Tiger was confirmed destroyed, its ammunition detonating in a spectacular explosion that witnesses described as unforgettable. The impact extended far beyond the physical destruction of the vehicle. German tank crews, already stressed by American material superiority in virtually every category, now faced a threat from a direction they had never anticipated. They could no longer park under trees for concealment because the L-4s could spot them anyway. They couldn't ignore the sound of small aircraft engines overhead because any one of them might be armed and hunting for targets. Each mission Carpenter flew pushed the boundaries of both physics and probability. The L-4 had never been designed for combat operations. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, which meant that a single tracer round could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. The pilot sat surrounded by nothing more than steel tubing and fabric, completely exposed to enemy fire from every direction. In his letters home, carefully censored to avoid worrying his wife unnecessarily, Carpenter hinted at the constant dangers he faced. After one particularly intense mission, he wrote simply that he had experienced some excitement that day. The plane had acquired a few more holes, but still flew fine. What he didn't mention to Elder was that those holes represented near misses that could easily have severed control cables, punctured fuel lines, or struck the pilot himself. The ground crews who serviced Rosie the Rocketer began keeping informal tallies of the damage the aircraft sustained. After particularly intense missions, they would count dozens of bullet holes requiring patches. The crew chief reportedly told other pilots that Carpenter's plane looked like Swiss cheese after one especially fierce engagement, yet somehow both the pilot and the aircraft continued to fly and fight. The psychological pressure on Carpenter must have been immense. Unlike bomber crews who flew at 20,000 feet, relatively removed from the immediate violence of combat, Carpenter engaged his targets at point-blank range. He could see individual German soldiers firing at him. He could see the expressions on tank commanders' faces as they realized what was happening. The combat was intensely personal and immediate in a way that most aerial warfare never was. Wes Gallagher, the Associated Press correspondent who interviewed Carpenter multiple times throughout the campaign, wrote in Liberty magazine that the Major was a legend in an outfit where reckless bravery was considered commonplace. But Gallagher also noted something else in his observations. There was a weariness in Carpenter's eyes, the look of a man who had pushed his luck repeatedly and understood the mathematical reality of the odds he was facing. The Bazooka installation on Carpenter's L4 underwent constant refinement based on his combat experience. The original mounting system using simple metal brackets proved inadequate because the recoil forces would gradually work the brackets loose. The plywood backing plates distributed the forces much better, but added crucial weight to an already overloaded aircraft. The electrical firing system presented particular challenges that required creative solutions. The wiring had to be routed through the wings and into the cockpit while being protected from both weather and enemy fire. Toggle switches were mounted on a simple panel within easy reach of the pilot's right hand. Each switch controlled one rocket, allowing for either single shots or volleys depending on the tactical situation. The system had to be reliable enough to function after hours of vibration and extreme maneuvers, yet simple enough to repair with basic tools in field conditions. Aiming remained entirely visual and intuitive throughout Carpenter's combat career. He developed his own personal system of reference points, using the engine cowling, the cockpit framework, and even scratches on the windscreen as improvised aiming guides. He had to calculate lead angles based on his approach speed and dive angle, while compensating for wind drift and the rocket's ballistic trajectory. There was no backup system and no second chance. If he missed his target, he had to climb away under fire and attempt another attack run. The rockets themselves presented unique challenges when fired from an aircraft. The M6A3 heat rounds had been designed for ground combat, fired from a soldier's shoulder at relatively stationary targets. When fired from a moving aircraft, their accuracy decreased significantly. The rocket motor burned for only 0.3 seconds, reaching maximum velocity quickly but then coasting unpowered to the target. Wind, aircraft motion, and the rocket's inherent inaccuracy meant that even perfect aim didn't guarantee a hit on the target. The Battle of Aracourt, where Carpenter achieved his most famous successes, represented more than just a tactical engagement between opposing forces. It was actually the largest tank battle fought on the Western Front during the entire war. American forces ultimately destroyed 200 German tanks and assault guns in the engagement, while losing only 25 of their own armoured vehicles. The German plan had called for the 5th Panzer Army to break through American lines and recapture Nancy, which would have threatened Patton's entire advance toward Germany. The attacking force included some of Germany's best remaining armoured units, though many were understrength and had been hastily reorganised after the disasters they had suffered in Normandy. The 4th Armoured Division, which was Carpenter's unit, bore the brunt of the German assault. Significantly outnumbered, they relied on superior tactics, better logistics, and innovative solutions like Carpenter's tank-hunting L4 to survive and prevail. The division's tank destroyers, artillery, and armoured units worked in close coordination, with Carpenter providing critical reconnaissance and direct attack capability that conventional doctrine never anticipated. His actions on September 20th came at an absolutely crucial moment in the battle. The German advance had achieved initial surprise, and some American positions were in genuine danger of being overrun by the attacking armor. By disrupting the Panther Company's attack when he did, Carpenter bought precious time for American forces to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. His attack wasn't just tactically successful in the immediate moment. It had operational implications for the entire battle that would unfold over the coming days. The psychological impact of his attacks rippled through German ranks far beyond those units he directly engaged. Tank crews who had felt relatively safe from air attack, knowing that American fighter bombers rarely operated in poor weather conditions, now had to fear even the smallest observation aircraft overhead. The constant need to scan for L4s and disperse formations when they appeared slowed German operations significantly and disrupted their coordination at the worst possible times. By November of 1944, Carpenter had become something of a celebrity within Patton's Third Army. Stars and Stripes ran multiple articles about Bazooka Charlie and his exploits. Popular Science magazine featured him in their February 1945 issue with an article titled "What's New in Aviation?" about the Piper Cub tank buster. Liberty magazine, the New York Sun, and numerous other publications picked up his story, making him one of the most famous pilots operating in the European theatre. But fame came with a price in the form of increased danger. German units throughout the region were specifically warned about rocket-armed Cubs operating in their sectors. Anti-aircraft defences were reinforced with additional light guns and machine guns positioned specifically to counter the L4 threat. Every mission Carpenter flew became increasingly hazardous as German gunners gained experience engaging slow-moving aircraft at low altitude. Carpenter's own comments to reporters who interviewed him revealed his fatalistic attitude toward survival. "Some people around here think I'm nuts," he told one journalist, "but I just believe that if we're going to fight a war, we have to get on with it 60 minutes an hour and 24 hours a day." When asked directly about the danger he faced on every mission, he simply shrugged and said his luck had been marvelous so far. That luck was tested repeatedly throughout his combat tour. Beyond the church steeple incident he mentioned in his letter home to Elder, there were numerous other close calls that could easily have been fatal. Machine gun fire once severed one of his elevator control cables, leaving him with minimal pitch control for the entire flight back to friendly territory. Another time, an anti-aircraft shell exploded close enough to pepper his aircraft with shrapnel, but miraculously the fragments missed both the pilot and all critical control systems. His crew chief, whose name has unfortunately been lost to history, reportedly begged Carpenter repeatedly to stop flying the rocket attacks. The ground crew had seen too many L4s return riddled with holes or simply fail to return at all. But Carpenter continued his missions, driven by some combination of duty and determination that his fellow pilots found both inspiring and deeply concerning. Carpenter's courage wasn't limited to aerial combat operations. On at least one documented occasion, he landed his L4 near an active battlefield, grabbed a discarded M1 rifle, and participated directly in ground combat. After destroying a German column with his bazookas from the air, he landed on a nearby road and took 6 German soldiers prisoner, marching them back 2 American lines at gunpoint. Another incident involved Carpenter landing near a disabled American Sherman tank that was under German fire. He climbed onto the tank and manned its .50 caliber machine gun, helping to drive off a German infantry assault while the tank crew conducted emergency repairs on their vehicle. His actions that day earned particular recognition from the tank crew, who credited him with saving their lives when they were most vulnerable. These ground combat episodes earned him recognition that extended beyond his aviation achievements. General Patton himself presented Carpenter with the Silver Star, reportedly telling him that this was exactly the kind of fighting man he wanted in his army. Carpenter would also receive the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster and the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his various actions. The ground combat episodes revealed something important about Carpenter's character that went beyond simple bravery. He wasn't content to be merely an observer or even a flying tank destroyer. He wanted to be directly involved in the fight wherever it was happening and using whatever weapons were available to him at the moment. This attitude, while certainly admirable from a military perspective, also suggested a man who was pushing himself beyond what any reasonable person would consider acceptable limits. The official records credit Carpenter with destroying 6 tanks total, with 2 Tiger heavy tanks included in that count, plus several armoured cars and trucks. However, unofficial accounts, including claims by witnesses who were present during various engagements, suggest the actual number might have been as high as 14 tanks either destroyed or disabled by his attacks. The discrepancy between official and unofficial counts likely reflects the difficulty of confirming kills in fluid combat situations where multiple weapons systems were engaging the same targets simultaneously. Each confirmed kill required an extraordinary alignment of circumstances to occur perfectly. The weather had to be suitable for flying, but poor enough that German fighters weren't active and prowling the skies. Carpenter had to locate appropriate targets worth the extreme risk. He had to approach without being shot down during the vulnerable attack run. He had to achieve accurate rocket hits on the vulnerable areas of the target. And finally, he had to survive the return fire and make it back to friendly territory. The mathematical probability of all these factors aligning successfully was minimal, yet he succeeded repeatedly against the odds. Consider the pure technical challenge involved in what he was attempting. He needed to hit a target measuring approximately 20 feet by 10 feet, which represents the approximate dimensions of a tank's vulnerable top armor, while flying at 70 miles per hour from a distance of just 100 yards. He was using unguided rockets fired from an inherently unstable platform while under fire from multiple weapons. Artillery observers who witnessed Carpenter's attacks from the ground described them as simultaneously impossible and insane. The 2 Tiger tanks that Carpenter destroyed represented particularly impressive achievements from both a tactical and strategic perspective. Each Tiger cost 250,000 Reichsmarks to produce and required specialized crews who had been trained for months in how to operate these complex machines effectively. They were considered nearly invulnerable to most Allied weapons in service. Yet they fell victim to rockets fired from an aircraft that cost the United States Army only $2,500 and required only basic pilot training to operate safely. Carpenter's role in the campaign extended well beyond tank hunting missions. As an observation pilot and as General Wood's personal aviator, he provided crucial intelligence that shaped operational decisions at the highest levels. His ability to fly low and slow, combined with his aggressive reconnaissance style, meant he often spotted German movements before any other intelligence sources could detect them. His reports directly influenced several major tactical decisions during the Lorraine campaign. When German forces attempted to concentrate their units for counterattacks, Carpenter's early warnings allowed American commanders to preposition reserves and artillery to meet the threat. His detailed observations of German defensive positions helped planners organize successful attacks with minimal casualties. The intelligence value of L4S was already well established throughout the army, but Carpenter's aggressive tactics yielded even more valuable information than standard observation flights. By forcing German units to react to his presence by shooting at him, dispersing their formations, and moving to cover, he revealed positions and strengths that might otherwise have remained hidden from American intelligence. This intelligence work, while less dramatic than his tank hunting exploits, may actually have been his most valuable overall contribution to the war effort. The information he provided saved countless American lives and shortened engagements that might otherwise have become prolonged battles of attrition. The success of Carpenter's improvised weapons system highlighted a curious aspect of Second World War technology that military historians have analyzed extensively since the war ended. Germany, despite its well-deserved reputation for advanced weaponry and engineering excellence, had no equivalent to the simple and effective L4 observation plane. The Wehrmacht relied on the Fieseler Storch for similar missions, but it was significantly larger, more complex mechanically, and produced in much smaller numbers than American observation planes. The American approach of mass-producing simple and reliable equipment proved superior in practice to the German emphasis on technological sophistication and engineering perfection. The L-4 was essentially just a civilian aircraft that had been pressed into military service with minimal modifications required. Yet its very simplicity became its greatest strength. It was easy to fly, easy to maintain, and easy to repair using only basic tools and readily available materials. Germany's tank designers had created truly magnificent machines that were optimized specifically for tank versus tank combat. The Panther's long 75mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where Allied return fire would be completely ineffective. Its frontal armour was nearly impervious to every weapon the Allies could field against it. But this optimization for ground-level combat created vulnerabilities that simple American ingenuity and pragmatism could exploit effectively. The Bazooka itself represented American pragmatism and rapid development capability at its finest. It had been developed quickly from a simple concept, then mass-produced in huge numbers that allowed distribution throughout the army. It gave every infantry squad genuine anti-tank capability without requiring complex training or maintenance. When Carpenter mounted 6 of them on an observation plane, he created a weapons system that German doctrine had never anticipated and couldn't effectively counter once it appeared. As 1944 turned into 1945, Carpenter continued flying combat missions, despite the increasing German awareness of rocket-armed cubs throughout their entire command structure. The Wehrmacht issued specific tactical instructions for dealing with armed observation aircraft, including dedicating anti-aircraft weapons to tracking and engaging them whenever they appeared over German-controlled territory. In December of 1944, during the massive German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Carpenter flew reconnaissance missions in absolutely terrible weather conditions that kept most other aircraft grounded. His reports on German movements helped American commanders formulate their response to the surprise offensive that threatened to split Allied forces. Though he had fewer opportunities for tank hunting in the consistently poor weather, his intelligence gathering during this critical period proved absolutely invaluable to the American response. January of 1945 brought renewed offensive operations as American forces began pushing systematically toward the Rhine River. Carpenter continued modifying and refining his tactics, constantly experimenting with different attack angles and various rocket combinations. He reportedly considered adding even more rockets to his aircraft, but was ultimately limited by the L-4's maximum weight capacity and the structural limits of the wing struts that had to bear the additional load. His last confirmed tank kill came in February of 1945 when he destroyed a Panzer IV that was attempting to defend a bridge crossing. Witnesses on the ground described him diving through an absolute wall of tracer fire to deliver his rockets at point-blank range. The destruction of that tank allowed American engineers to capture the bridge intact rather than having to rebuild it after demolition, which significantly accelerated the advance into Germany proper. In March of 1945, Carpenter began experiencing severe fatigue and other troubling symptoms that forced him to reduce his flying schedule significantly. Medical examination revealed advanced Hodgkin's disease, which is a cancer affecting the lymphatic system. Army doctors gave him a prognosis of approximately 2 years to live. The diagnosis ended his combat flying career immediately and completely. He was evacuated to the United States for treatment, leaving behind both Rosie the Rocketer and the formidable reputation he had earned as one of the war's most unusual combat aces. His personal war was over, though the larger conflict would continue for 2 more months before Germany's final surrender. The timing of his medical evacuation was perhaps fortunate from a survival perspective. As German forces became increasingly desperate during the war's final months, their anti-aircraft defences became correspondingly more deadly and effective. Several L-4s attempting to emulate Carpenter's aggressive tactics were shot down during March and April of 1945. The window of opportunity for his unique form of aerial warfare was rapidly closing as German desperation intensified. Carpenter received an honorable discharge from the United States Army in 1946 and returned to civilian life and teaching. Against all medical predictions, he survived far longer than the 2 years doctors had initially given him to live. He taught history at Urbana High School in Illinois, resuming married life with Elder and raising their daughter Carol. Remarkably, he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences with anyone outside his immediate family. His daughter would later reveal in interviews that she knew very little about his combat record until after his death. This silence about wartime service was quite common among combat veterans of that generation, but it seems particularly poignant given the extraordinary nature of Carpenter's specific service and achievements. During summer breaks from teaching, he operated a boys' camp in the Ozark Mountains, where he taught outdoor skills and character development to young men. Former campers who were interviewed decades later remembered him as strict but fundamentally fair, demanding but genuinely supportive of his students. None of them had any idea they were being taught by one of the war's most decorated tank hunters and innovative combat pilots. His health gradually deteriorated through the 1950s and early 1960s as the disease progressed. The Hodgkin's disease that should have killed him back in 1947 instead became a chronic condition he battled courageously for 20 years. He continued teaching until shortly before his death on March 22, 1966, at the age of 53. For decades after the war ended, the ultimate fate of Rosie the Rocketer remained completely unknown to military historians and aviation enthusiasts. The aircraft had presumably been scrapped like thousands of other war-surplus L-4s, with its historical significance going completely unrecognized in the post-war disposal of military equipment. Then, in October of 2017, aviation historians made a truly remarkable discovery that seemed almost impossible. Serial number 43-30426 was found in the collection of the Austrian Aviation Museum, located in Bad Vöslau, Austria. How the aircraft had arrived there remained unclear, but careful examination of serial numbers and other identifying markings confirmed beyond any doubt that this was indeed Carpenter's aircraft. Even more remarkably, the aircraft retained clear physical evidence of its combat service, including multiple professionally patched bullet holes that had been repaired during the war. The Collings Foundation acquired the historic aircraft in 2019 and brought it back to the United States for proper preservation. A careful and historically accurate restoration followed, with historians and skilled technicians working together to return Rosie to her authentic wartime configuration. The bullet hole patches were deliberately preserved as physical historical evidence of the aircraft's genuine combat service and the dangers it had faced. The restoration process revealed previously undocumented details about Carpenter's specific modifications to the aircraft. The original mounting points for the bazookas were still clearly visible on the wing struts where they had been installed. Careful analysis of the patches showed that bullets had struck the aircraft from multiple different angles, which confirmed eyewitness accounts describing attacks conducted through heavy ground fire. Some patches actually overlapped other patches, suggesting strongly that the aircraft had been hit, repaired, and then hit again multiple times throughout its combat service. While Carpenter's bazooka-armed L-4 was never officially adopted as a standard weapons system by the military establishment, the underlying concept influenced military thinking significantly about the value of organic Army aviation. The idea that ground forces needed their own dedicated air support that wasn't dependent on Air Force priorities and availability gained considerable credibility through dramatic examples like Carpenter's direct battlefield intervention. The Korean War that followed saw limited experiments with armed light aircraft, though none achieved anything approaching Carpenter's level of success. The real vindication of his basic concept came much later with the development of attack helicopters during the 1960s. Aircraft like the AH-1 Cobra and later the Apache helicopters embodied precisely the same fundamental principle that Carpenter had demonstrated. Slow, low-altitude platforms could deliver precise direct fire support to ground forces engaged in combat. Modern military doctrine clearly recognizes the value of what Carpenter demonstrated through his actions. Air support doesn't always require fast jets dropping heavy bombs from high altitude. Sometimes the most valuable capability is precise firepower delivered at close range by a platform that can loiter over the battlefield and continuously observe the developing tactical situation. The improvised nature of Carpenter's entire weapon system also influenced military thinking substantially about field modifications and soldier-driven innovation. The United States military became noticeably more receptive to bottom-up improvements originating from combat troops, recognizing that soldiers actively engaged in fighting often developed practical solutions to problems that rear-echelon engineers had never even considered or anticipated. In 2023, Carpenter's daughter Carol Apaki co-authored a comprehensive book titled Bazooka Charlie, the unbelievable story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer, working with aviation writer James Busher. The book, which was based on hundreds of carefully preserved letters and photographs, revealed the complex man behind the dramatic legend. The letters showed someone who was certainly brave but not reckless for the sake of being reckless, aggressive in combat but thoughtful about the implications of his actions. His personal writing revealed someone who clearly understood the profound moral complexities of war while maintaining absolute determination to fulfill his duty to the best of his ability. He expressed genuine pride in his achievements and his effectiveness as a combat pilot, but he also expressed sadness at the fundamental necessity of killing other human beings. One particularly poignant letter, written shortly after he had destroyed a Tiger tank and killed its crew, reflected deeply on the humanity of his enemies. They were someone's sons, he wrote, and perhaps fathers themselves. But they were actively trying to kill my friends, and I simply couldn't allow that to happen. This kind of emotional intelligence, combined with his tactical brilliance and physical courage, made him genuinely exceptional among warriors of any era. Carol Apaki described her father in interviews as fundamentally a peaceful man who had somehow managed to compartmentalize his intense war experiences. He had moved on emotionally, she explained in various interviews. She believed he had come back from the war mentally shattered in ways that weren't immediately obvious, and it had been an extremely hard time for her mother Elder as well, trying to start their life over again after waiting 4 long years for him to come home while genuinely believing he never would return alive. A bronze sculpture was unveiled at Moline High School in 2023 to commemorate Carpenter's extraordinary service. The sculpture shows him standing beside a detailed representation of his L-4 aircraft. The dedication ceremony drew military veterans, aviation historians, and enthusiasts from all across the country to honor his memory. Former students from his teaching years, now elderly themselves, shared warm memories of a dedicated and demanding educator who had never once mentioned his wartime heroics to any of them during their time in his classroom. The American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts, where the fully restored Rosie the Rocketer is now permanently displayed, created an extensive and detailed exhibit specifically about Carpenter's service and achievements. Museum visitors can see the actual aircraft complete with its preserved bullet holes and learn comprehensively about the man who transformed an unarmed observation plane into an effective tank destroyer through sheer innovation and courage. The Experimental Aircraft Association features Carpenter's remarkable story prominently in their educational programs, using his innovation as a perfect example of American ingenuity, determination, and creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Young pilots learning to fly today study not just his specific tactical achievements, but the kind of creative thinking that successfully turns apparent limitations into genuine advantages. Military historians continue actively studying Carpenter's tactics and analyzing their measurable impact on the Lorraine campaign's ultimate outcome. While his 6 officially confirmed tank kills might seem quite modest when compared to the thousands of tanks destroyed throughout the Second World War, the psychological and tactical impact of his actions far exceeded what the raw numbers alone might suggest. Carpenter's success raises genuinely important questions about innovation, courage, and the fundamental nature of warfare itself. How exactly did a high school history teacher with no special combat training whatsoever become one of the war's most unusual and effective aces? The answer lies in a rare combination of factors that very seldom align perfectly. First, and most importantly, his unique position as General Wood's personal pilot gave him unusual operational freedom to pursue his own tactical initiatives. Most L-4 pilots were strictly restricted to specific reconnaissance patterns and rigid schedules that left no room for individual action. Carpenter enjoyed unusual latitude that allowed him to hunt targets of opportunity, choosing precisely when and where to strike for maximum effect. Second, his background as a history teacher may have contributed significantly to his tactical thinking in ways that weren't immediately obvious. History teachers inherently understand patterns, cause and effect, and the critical importance of timing in shaping outcomes. Carpenter applied these analytical skills directly to combat situations, recognizing vulnerabilities that others with different backgrounds might have completely missed. Third, the specific conditions of the Lorraine campaign created unique opportunities for his unusual tactics. The relatively open terrain, the high concentration of German armor in limited areas, and the fluid nature of the battle meant that valuable targets were consistently available if someone possessed sufficient courage to engage them directly. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Carpenter possessed an extremely rare combination of physical courage and philosophical fatalism that allowed him to repeatedly risk everything without hesitation. His comment about attacking 60 minutes an hour and 24 hours a day revealed someone who had fundamentally accepted the statistical likelihood of death and had decided to make his inevitable sacrifice count for something meaningful. The statistics of Carpenter's combat service, when examined closely and objectively, reveal just how extraordinary his achievement actually was. 6 tanks officially confirmed destroyed, with 2 massive Tiger heavy tanks included in that total count. Multiple additional armoured vehicles and trucks destroyed in various engagements. 16 rockets fired during just 3 sorties on September 20th alone. Approximately 100 combat missions flown throughout his combat tour. 0 L-4 Grasshopper aircraft lost despite sustaining multiple bullet strikes on virtually every mission, and 1 pilot who somehow survived what should have been completely impossible odds. Each number in that statistical summary represents literally dozens of split-second decisions during combat, any single one of which could easily have proven fatal. The simple fact that Carpenter survived his entire combat tour genuinely defied all reasonable probability. Contemporary pilots who attempted to emulate similar aggressive tactics rarely survived more than just a few missions before being shot down. The economic equation involved was equally remarkable when analysed from a purely financial perspective. The total cost of Carpenter's L-4 aircraft plus all modifications was less than $5,000 in wartime currency. The Tiger tanks he personally destroyed cost over 250,000 Reichsmarks each to produce, not even counting the enormous expense of training crews and transporting the vehicles to the battlefield. In purely financial terms, Carpenter achieved one of the highest return on investment ratios of the entire war. Despite extensive documentation of his service, some aspects of Carpenter's story remain genuinely mysterious even today. How exactly did he maintain the psychological stability necessary to continue flying such extraordinarily dangerous missions day after day? What internal motivation drove him to push far beyond the already dangerous job of observation, flying into the realm of direct combat engagement? His personal letters provide some intriguing clues, but no complete or satisfying answers to these questions. He wrote extensively about duty and about his desire to protect fellow soldiers. He wrote about desperately wanting the war to end so he could finally return home to his family. But these motivations, while certainly admirable and understandable, don't fully explain the extraordinary risks he took repeatedly and voluntarily. Perhaps the real answer lies in understanding his generational context more broadly. The men who fought in the Second World War had already survived the Great Depression, which gave them a deep understanding of hardship and sacrifice that later generations might struggle to fully comprehend. They had personally witnessed the rise of fascism across Europe and understood it represented an existential threat to democracy itself. For someone like Carpenter, who had taught history and deeply understood the stakes involved, half measures and cautious approaches were simply unacceptable when civilization itself hung in the balance. Or perhaps the explanation was actually much simpler and more direct than complex psychological analysis might suggest. In war, ordinary people sometimes accomplish extraordinary things simply because circumstances demand it and because someone must act. Carpenter saw a clear problem before him. German tanks were killing American soldiers. He found an unconventional solution to that problem, however improbable it might have seemed to others. The fact that his solution required flying a fragile fabric-covered plane into point-blank range of enemy guns was simply an acceptable risk given the alternative of inaction. Carpenter's innovations influenced far more than just immediate military tactics during the war. His story became an integral part of the broader mythology of American ingenuity that helped define the post-war national identity. The idea that a clever individual working with basic tools and materials could overcome sophisticated enemy technology through sheer determination and creative thinking resonated powerfully throughout American culture. This narrative proved particularly compelling in post-war America as the nation sought to understand and explain its hard-won victory over enemies that had initially seemed so formidable and technologically advanced. Carpenter's David versus Goliath story provided an almost perfect metaphor for the larger conflict. American practicality and individual initiative had triumphed decisively over vaunted German engineering excellence and rigid military tradition. The story also profoundly influenced how the American military establishment thought about encouraging innovation from within its ranks. Rather than automatically dismissing unconventional ideas originating from junior officers or enlisted personnel, commanders throughout the services became noticeably more open to considering field expedients and soldier-driven improvements. The fundamental lesson of Bazooka Charlie was absolutely clear to anyone paying attention. Sometimes the very best solutions to complex problems come directly from those people who are closest to the problem and must deal with its consequences daily. For the aviation community specifically, Carpenter's exploits demonstrated convincingly the remarkable versatility of light aircraft when used creatively. The humble Piper Cub, originally designed purely as a civilian trainer and pleasure aircraft, had proven itself capable of roles that its designers had never even remotely imagined possible. This demonstrated versatility would directly influence post-war aircraft development, with designers increasingly considering multiple potential uses for their creations rather than optimizing for just one narrow mission. The story of Charles Bazooka. Charlie Carpenter genuinely defies every conventional military narrative and expectation. A mild-mannered history teacher flying an unarmed observation plane should never have been able to destroy German heavy tanks in direct combat. A fabric-covered aircraft powered by a tiny 65-horsepower engine should never have survived repeated combat missions against concentrated ground fire. 6 bazookas simply strapped to fragile wing struts should never have constituted an effective weapons system capable of changing tactical outcomes. Yet somehow, all of these seemingly impossible things actually happened during those crucial months between September of 1944 and February of 1945. Carpenter successfully transformed the L-4 Grasshopper from a purely passive observation platform into an active and feared combat system. His official tally of 6 tanks destroyed, with 2 massive Tiger tanks included in that count, stands as one of the most genuinely improbable achievements in the entire history of military aviation. The German forces operating at Aricourt and throughout the broader Lorraine campaign learned to genuinely fear the distinctive sound of small aircraft engines overhead. What had previously been harmless spotters worthy of nothing more than casual attention became potential instruments of death descending from above. Tank crews, who had felt relatively safe from American fighter bombers, which rarely operated effectively in poor weather or at dangerously low altitudes, now faced a threat they simply couldn't counter effectively with available weapons and tactics. The transformation in German tactical doctrine, from casually ignoring L-4s to engaging them desperately with every available weapon, demonstrates clearly the strategic impact of one determined pilot's innovation. Carpenter forced the Wehrmacht to fundamentally adapt its anti-aircraft defences, to disperse its carefully planned armoured formations, and to constantly monitor the skies for slow-moving aircraft. These forced adjustments disrupted German operations significantly and contributed measurably to American success throughout the Lorraine campaign. More than just military achievement, Carpenter's story represents the ultimate triumph of creative ingenuity over rigid conventional thinking. Faced with the serious problem of German armoured superiority, he created an unprecedented solution using only available materials and extraordinary personal determination. The bazookas had been designed exclusively for infantry use. The L-4 had been designed purely for observation duties. Combined together by someone willing to risk absolutely everything, they became something that neither designers nor military planners had ever imagined remotely possible. The restored Rosie the Rocketer, now displayed permanently with all its historical battle damage carefully preserved, stands as a physical testament to American innovation and individual courage under fire. Each carefully patched bullet hole represents a specific moment when probability strongly suggested catastrophic failure, yet Carpenter pressed his attack anyway. The aircraft that should logically have been destroyed multiple times instead survived intact to tell its remarkable story to future generations who might otherwise never believe such things were possible. Charles Carpenter died in March of 1966, having dramatically outlived his doctor's grim prognosis by a full 19 years through sheer determination. He spent those precious additional years teaching young Americans about history, perhaps hoping they would internalize the crucial lesson that ordinary people can achieve genuinely extraordinary things when circumstances absolutely demand it. His students remembered him consistently as demanding but fundamentally fair, never suspecting for a moment they were being taught by someone who had fundamentally changed the nature of aerial warfare through pure willpower and innovation. The German tank crews who faced him across the fields of France would have been absolutely stunned to learn their terrifying nemesis was just a high school history teacher with no special qualifications. They would have been equally amazed to discover that the sophisticated weapon system terrorizing them was actually nothing more than 6 standard infantry bazookas strapped somewhat precariously to a flimsy civilian aircraft. But perhaps after their initial shock wore off, they would have understood the larger and more important truth being demonstrated. In warfare, genuine innovation combined with raw courage and absolute determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The tiny L-4 grasshopper that successfully hunted massive panthers and tigers across the French countryside proved conclusively that David could still defeat Goliath, especially when David possessed 6 slingshots and the extraordinary courage to use them at point-blank range, regardless of the risks involved. In the end, that may well be the most important and enduring lesson from Bazooka Charlie's war. Human ingenuity and raw courage can transform even the humblest and most unlikely tools into genuine weapons of victory when wielded by someone who refuses to accept conventional limitations on what might be possible.